那各位老师好，那我们今天特别的高兴大家能来参加我们这次的系列讲座，而且我们非常荣幸的请来了北京师范大学的潘林老师来给我们做这次讲座。潘林老师是北京师范大学英语系的副主任。那也是我们语言教学方面的专家。那下面在开始之前呢，我先简短的介绍一下潘林老师。So Lin received her PhD from the Institute of Education as their centenary scholar, and then she's currently an associate professor and vice chair of the English department at Beijing Normal University, China. She also serves as the Director of Global Issues and Language Education for the Special Topic Committee at TESOL China Assembly. She is a member of the Executive Committee for Ayla's Home Ren, was that REN, REN, and a board member for the China Association of Language Governance. Before she joining the BNU, she was the John Adams Research Fellow and Coordinator for the Mandarin Excellence Program at the UCL Institute of Education. She has also held positions as Associate Professor at Beijing Language and Culture University and as a Program Officer at the Chinese Ministry of Education. Her research interests include language ideologies, social linguistics, and language education. She is the author of the book English as a Global Language in China, Deconstructing the Ideological Discourse of English in Language Education, and it was published by Springer International in 2015. And she also co-edited Mandarin Chinese Teacher Education Issues and Solutions published by the UCL IOE Press in 2018. Her most recent publication is the second edition of Exploring World Englishes with Philip Surgeon, which will be published by Routledge in 2025. 所以非常感谢潘林老师今天能来，那我们现在就把整个的这个舞台交给潘林老师，谢谢。
Thank you. 谢谢谷老师哈，Thank you for your very kind introduction. 然后我也是特别荣幸今天能为我们 BCLTS 的老师们做一个课题的分享，因为我记得我其实从06年开始就是我们 BCLTS 的这个一个成员，然后当时呢我们也是参加了很多届的这个会哈，然后当时我在做成员的时候，我记得还是我们特别 senior 的张新生老师，然后呢，当时宋连怡老师。其实我虽然现在在英文系工作，但是我是从07年就开始，先在 SOS 做 Mandarin Chinese 的这个 teaching，然后后来呢又有机会来做这个 teenager 的 Mandarin Chinese teaching，所以呢，其实也是有将近20年的这个时间了所以呢，最近呢，我跟大家分享一下这个 Mandarin Excellence Program 的一些最新的研究。虽然是 teenager 的这些 data，但是其实我觉得我们每一个语言学习者都是 applicable，就是大家都会。刚才我跟杜老师说有这种 deja vu，就是似曾相识的感觉。所以这种 university students and also 这种 adult learners of languages 都会有一些启迪和帮助。所以呢，对我来讲，语言学习是无国界也没有边界的，所以我们不能够把它给它划分为清晰的英语教学、法语教学、日语教学和中文教学，因为语言学习它是一个 general field，所以我们可以互相来学习。这样，其实我们虽然说 Mandarin Chinese 这些这个 research 相对比较少，但是如果我们把它看成一个完整的一个大的一个领域的话，其实我们有很多东西可以借鉴。这样的话，我认为能够更加帮助我们 Mandarin Chinese 的 research 和它的这种发展，好吧？好，那我这是有一个比较 wordy 的开场白。那么谢谢谷老师的介绍，然后也谢谢我们苏老师，还有我们整个 BCLTS 的所有的老师的这个邀请。那么现在呢，我就开始和大家来分享我这个屏幕OK，大家是可以看到的，对吧？ Okay, good. Okay, so thank you very much. This is my topic. It's a crossing borders with Mandarin, language socialization and identity in Chinese and British context. My research is done in English, so mainly I will use English, but as we are all Chinese speakers, I will language a bit just throughout my presentation. So from this title, actually one element is missing, that is who. So basically, my research to be shared with you would be the British secondary school Mandarin Chinese learners, their learning of Mandarin Chinese, okay, and in their process of learning, how they socialize with Mandarin Chinese and how did they construct their identity in both China and in the UK. Okay, so before I share my research, I would like to extend my acknowledgements. I'm particularly thankful to the participating schools and students, and also the Mandarin Excellence Programs teachers and head teachers for their support throughout the research. And in particular, I would like to thank the UCL IOE MEP team and specifically Catherine Carruthers for their trust and also for their commitment to MEP endeavor. Okay, so this is my topic in Chinese. So you can see from the screen, there are two key terms. One is language socialization, the other is identity construction，就是我们翻译成语言社会化和这个叫身份的塑造哈。OK，好，这个我看我这个突然它不能够 OK，好，so a few issues to share with you. One is the rising prominence of Mandarin Chinese, and then so this is the background, and then we'll talk about some theoretical issue. One is the language socialization, and the other is identity construction. But I would like to situate these two topics, or these two issues, just within a broader concept of a community of practice. And then I'm going to share with you my research design. And then in particular, I would like to share with you some of the very interesting data which will lead to discussion. Okay, so let's look at the rising prominence of Mandarin Chinese. There is a very global, well, Mandarin is becoming a very globally significant language with increasing numbers of learners worldwide. For example, by the end of 2021, more than 180 countries and regions had launched Chinese education and programs, and 76 countries had included Chinese in their national education systems, and nearly 200 million foreigners had learned and used Chinese, and more than 25 million foreigners were currently learning the language. So this growing recognition of China's cultural and economic importance drives demand for Mandarin proficiency and intercultural competence among young learners. But what about the situation in the UK? In the UK, Mandarin Chinese teaching in schools, especially in England, had remained very much marginal. For example, in 2013, only 0.7% students registered GCSE examinations that ranked only the eighth among all the more modern foreign languages on offer in the UK. But in 2016, modern foreign languages had become a required subjects in students' Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. Okay, I'm sure that you are familiar with Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. That's students from year 7, or age 7 to age 14, right? So all these students, they had to choose modern foreign languages, okay, as a test subject. And therefore, it seems that possibly Mandarin Chinese status will change as well. And it seems that a political push was needed to integrate Mandarin Chinese in the mainstream curriculum. And exactly in the year 2016, the former Chancellor of Exchequer, George Osborne, made his official visit to China. And in his official visit to China, he made it clear, a few issues, and especially he listed the importance of Mandarin Chinese. He said that in Britain, there is a hunger to learn more and understand more about this great civilization. And I see it at home in Downing Street every night as my 12-year-old daughter does her Mandarin homework. So after his visit, right, exactly in the same year, a 10 million pounds investment was made in the Mandarin Excellence Program. And this program was very much significant because it was the largest ever language or modern foreign language investment made by the Department of Education in the UK. So what is Mandarin Excellence Program? The Mandarin Excellence Program aimed to integrate Mandarin into the mainstream educational system in the UK. And this is the strategic importance of Mandarin. And we all know that Mandarin used to be only in the extracurricular activities in the UK or in England. And also Mandarin was only offered as a kind of taster sessions in a lot of schools, right? But once the school, okay, becomes MEP school, that's Mandarin Excellence Program or school, okay, well, it requires the students who are enrolled in the program to have 8 hours of intensive learning per week, which is a lot of time. And by September 2024, 76 schools had joined the program. Specifically, Mandarin Excellent Program students are expected to join a 2-week cultural study trip in China after 3 years of intensive training in the UK. And this is the highlight of this program. And why I'm saying this is highlight of the program, because the students, they will have the experience of learning Mandarin both in China and in the UK. And in this process of intercultural communication, the students' perceptions, their goals and behaviors are closely tied to how they position themselves and are positioned by others in language communities. And therefore, I'm interested in this kind of intercultural communication process, okay, and how the students they feel about their language learning. So in particular, I will investigate the students' language socialization and identity construction in their learning of Mandarin in China and in the UK. So we'll explore how the MEP students develop their Mandarin language skills and cultural identities through different learning contexts in the UK and China. And we'll aim to understand the impact of immersion experiences in China versus classroom-based learning in the UK on students' language socialization and identity construction. So the two research questions are focused on one, on social language socialization, the other on the students' language identity construction. Specifically, research question A is how does Mandarin as second language students, their language socialization in China differ from their experiences in the UK? And second question, how do language socialization differences in these two communities shape the students' identity construction? Okay. Now let's look at the key terms. One is second language socialization, the other is identity construction. But I want to put these two key issues within the broader context of communities. So we'll study the community of practice theories. So what is community of practice theories? So according to Lev and Wanger, right, learning is fundamentally social. Community of practice emphasizes legitimate peripheral participation. That is to say, any newcomers, when they just enter the community, they will first of all experience peripheral participation. But gradually, after shared activities or after emerge in this environment for a period of time, the newcomers will become oldcomers and will gradually become full members and play a role in the community. I'm sure all of us have the same experience when you find a new job or when you come to a new setting. For example, you move from China to the UK. So you will first of all have a kind of uneasiness, right? And you are not familiar with the setting and you feel confused, and even you sometimes will feel you will you feel lost help hope, and also you want to just go back to your old community. But gradually, after a period of time, you are used to everything and you started to love the new community. So this is community of practice. And then later, Wenger expanded his community of practice theory to identity formation. And he says that learning involves developing a sense of self in relation to the community. And language learning is a kind of social process where identities will gradually be shaped through participation in shared activities. So we'll focus on identity construction in community of practice. But actually, existing research has largely focused on language learners in single, often classroom-based context, and less attention is paid to how learners navigate and negotiate their identities across multiple communities of practice. And that's why in this study that I'm sharing with you today, we are going to study or to compare two settings, two communities. One is language learning in the UK, the other is language learning in China. Okay, so that is the broader context of a community. So what about identity? When talking about identity, I would rather to adopt a post-structuralist view. That is, to put it simply, identity is dynamic and identity is contextual. To say identity is dynamic because identity is fluid. It's not static, it's ever changing and it's gradually constructed and reconstructed. I would say your identity today would be different from your identity tomorrow, and your identity in China, built in China, is quite different from your new identity in the UK. And when you go back to China, your identity will be changed as well. Because now I am just going to different communities, and my identity is kind of constructed and reconstructed. And sometimes I also feel very much uneasy. Another thing is that identity is contextual. That is to say, power relations and emotional experiences shape identities. Okay. And sometimes when you have different emotions and you will feel you have a different self. Okay. But to say that I adopt a post-structuralist view towards identity, we also need to identify, or we also need to acknowledge the limitations of post-structuralist view. That is, usually post-structuralist approaches, they emphasize more on discourse or discourse construction, and they ignore agencies and individualities. The other thing is when we use post-structuralist theories, usually they are very abstract social theories, but a lot of research context would be in education settings and schools and classrooms. They are very practical. And therefore, I want to, well, in my study, or in this piece of study, I want to emphasize on agencies and practical settings of schools. Okay, and therefore we'll observe how Mandarin learners begin when they just came to China, how they started to renegotiate their identities in transitional stages. So we'll emphasize on agencies, the Mandarin learners, and we will also emphasize the practical settings of schools of different communities of China and also the UK. Okay, so the third issue is about language socialization. So what is language socialization? Language socialization is a process of acquiring communicative competence and legitimacy in a new language community. And language socialization happens both in formal instruction and informal interaction. Language socialization also involves learning to use language in culturally appropriate ways. And this is the purpose of language socialization. That gradually you understand how to use the language appropriately in kind of a culturally appropriate settings. And research has shown that both first and second language socialization are influenced by cultural context and social interactions. And therefore, we'll zoom in second language socialization. In second language acquisition, learners must navigate between their existing cultural identities and new linguistic communities. And this will lead to their identity negotiation and transformation. But actually, when they are kind of moving from one community to another community using the language, the process is not really smooth. Sometimes they will face some challenges, some unique challenges, because quite often they will bring their own cultural and also their own linguistic background to new learning environments. For example, your learning of English, for example, in China and your learning of English in the UK would be different. And sometimes you feel, hey, I am quite a successful learner. Okay, but sometimes you will also feel very much frustrated because there could be some challenges either in your learning in China and also in your learning in the UK. So we'll address both the success and also the challenges in this learning journey. Now, let's look at the research design. Okay, so my research is situated, in two settings, as I have said, but mainly I recruited year 10 students aged 14 and 15 from 8 UK secondary schools. They participated in the Mandarin Excellence Program, and we conducted a few more than 150 surveys, and we finally have got 126 surveys, and they are mainly we conducted 15 interviews. That's me and my research assistant as a team. And why we have done research on year 10 students, because these group of students, they had already had 3 to 4 years of Mandarin learning experience in the UK, and they have just completed a 2-week immersive program in China. And the group of students include monolingual English learners with a background of monolingual English parents, right? And then some of them are bilingual learners, like maybe their parents are either from Britain or maybe from China. And also there are some other bilingual and multilingual learners. In terms of the research method, we employed mixed methods approach. So these are the two research questions. We have language we study the first research question is about language socialization patterns in both the UK and in China, okay? And the other is the identity negotiation. So in terms of language socialization, we did quantitative surveys. We compared language engagement and identity coherence between the UK and China context. And as I introduced to you the community of practice theory, so we in particular examined 3 dimensions. One is about the formal instructional engagement. The other is informal interaction patterns. The third thing is the activity type preference. And then in terms of the second research question, the identity negotiation, we did 15 interviews. Mainly, there are a lot of themes generated, but mainly today, I'm going to just share with you about cultural embodiment, language practice, and identity shifts. And we used a thematic analysis. So this is giving you a view about the how we generated the themes via thematic analysis. Okay, first of all, we had the interview transcripts, and then we did open coding, And then we used the in vivo, okay, for analysis, and then we compared all these coding and did the cross case patterning, and then gradually we just generated some of the codes. Okay. Now let's look at some of the surveys and interview data. Okay, so let's first of all look at the survey. We'll look at two things. One is language socialization, okay? The other is about their identity construction. Now, this is about the language socialization. We did, we compare their, students, in China and in the UK, their formal and informal learning engagement. We look at their identity coherence and fragmentation, and also we look at their activity type preference. So this is the result. Okay. Okay. Let me move the screen there. Okay, let's look at their instructional engagement. So in China and in the UK, students' instructional engagement were totally different. Well, it's very clear from this chart. In China, the students' hours of instructional engagement almost doubled that in the UK. So that is to say, in China, the student, they had kind of a higher and more intensified and also full immersion. While in the UK, their engagement is more longitudinal, no, but also less intensive. So from these data, we can see that actually almost 90% of the students, they reported that structured immersion significantly improved their Mandarin preference or proficiency. Okay. And in terms of informal interaction, we see that actually in China, students had 1 hour of kind of an informal interaction, okay, average 1 hour of informal interaction in China. That is also more than that in the UK. That is to say, students had greater engagement in informal Mandarin interaction, while in the UK, okay, their informal interaction was very much limited. So 76% of the students, they felt more confident in using Mandarin informally after their immersion experience in China. And then in terms of activity type preferences, we see that in China, it's quite the usual practice that in China, students had predominantly receptive activities like listening and reading activities. But in the UK, their learning is more productive. So this is very much in line with the teaching culture in these two settings. Okay, and that is very much in line with Patricia Duff's idea that instructional contexts systematically shape language socialization patterns. Okay. But actually, that is the language socialization. Well, in a way, we see it's a kind of idealized picture. But actually, we also find some inconsistency. And because this is the early stage, because we emphasize on students just coming to China the first 2 weeks. All right. And we see there are students, they reported some inconsistencies and also they feel uneasy and some challenge. For example, majority of the respondents reported that they had language barriers, and language barriers were a major challenge for their stay in China and their communication in China. Also, 1/3 of the students reported that there is a kind of a difficulty interacting with Mandarin speakers outside the classroom. And despite the structured, immersive environment, many participants still faced substantial linguistic and cultural adaptation hurdles during their intensive study. So when we are talking and when we are just doing research on language socialization, on study abroad research, we shouldn't ignore the students' negative feelings, or sometimes they feel uneasy, because especially at the very beginning stage, students were not just adjusted to this new learning environment. Okay, and then we need to report faithfully what they felt at this very much beginning stage, and this can be very beneficial for research and also be beneficial for language policy making when we are designing study abroad program. So after talking about the language socialization, we'll also look at the identity construction. Okay, so from the data, we can see there is a kind of identity coherence. Okay, so if you look at table 6, we see that students in China, okay, they feel very much more like cultural bridges. 78% of the students felt that they are more like cultural bridges. Okay, that's more than they feel that when they were in the UK. And students felt very much culturally motivated, and they had more time for this kind of a native interaction, that is interacting with the native speakers while in China. And also their motivation action gap was very low in China. Okay, only 15% of the students felt there is a kind of motivation action gap. So what is motivation action gap? It is the you are motivated at what you are doing. So this is, if you are very much motivated at what you are doing, then the gap would be very low. But if you are not motivated at what you are doing, then your motivation action gap will be high. Okay, so we see that environment mediates identity construction. And the British students, they demonstrated different identity position patterns between their China and UK learning experiences. Okay, now in table 7 is something just in contrast to the identity coherence, because it also expresses the students' identity fragmentation. Because if you look at the table, you find that the student didn't really realize that there were some positive changes. And this is actually also in line with this initial, exchange, because it's the initial period of their language exchange. So they didn't see a lot of positive changes. And also they had more modal contradictions. They felt that their exchange were not really meeting their expectation and their aspiration. At the same time, they felt there is a kind of competence gap. Okay, more than half of students felt there is a kind of a competence gap. That is to say, they were not able to they didn't have enough linguistic competence to meet their social aspiration, to meet their social need. And at the same time, there is a kind of a time conflict, because they felt that a lot of time were restrained to classroom settings in China, and they really wanted to integrate more into the social interactions, okay, with the local Chinese. So here we see there is a kind of identity fragmentation. That is, newcomers in the community, they lack full access or consistent investment in the community, and their identities may become conflicted and unstable. Okay, so we have studied the identity constructions and fragmentations, and also we have studied their language socializations, and we see that in the UK there is a kind of input-focused engagement. While students gradually build coherent identities in the process of building coherent identities. And also there is a consistent motivation behavior alignment. Well, in the UK, while students focus more on productive output, but their identity was fragmented, and also sometimes there is a participation identity dissonance. And the conclusion or a little summary to draw here is that there is a lack of immersive participation opportunities can limit identity consolidation and heighten feelings of marginalization. So after sharing this kind of a survey result, I would also like to share with you some interview codings and some interview stories. So mainly I will focus on four themes. One is the cultural embodiment and language practice. The other is a classroom to real world language border crossing. The third thing is identity metamorphosis. And the last thing is about transformative encounters. Now, let's look at the first theme, that is a culture embodiment and sustained engagement. Well, when the student they join their China trip, actually they did a lot of very significant cultural experience or cultural activities via their group learning. So there were some school trips where when the teachers and the schools organized them to join some local activities like Taiji, like Chinese calligraphy experience, and also, for example, they went to the supermarket or the markets, the silk markets in Beijing, so where the students really experience the culture. They see the culture, they experience culture. So the learning of Mandarin Chinese and Chinese culture is really a lived experience. Okay, and they were totally merged in this kind of environment. So we see that in language learning, genuine understanding arises from integrating language with the community's practices, not just memorizing abstract forms. So these kind of cultural immersion were really kind of encouraged, okay, in this kind of language socialization and cultural exchange. But actually, students' experience were not really restrained to this kind of organized cultural experience or organized groups of cultural experience. Individual cultural experience also counted a lot in students' uh, language learning or cultural learning. For example, let's read excerpt one. Okay, it's about students' bargaining experience. For example, these students, she said that bargaining at the night market was a crash course in real Chinese. There was no script. I had to joke and haggle in Mandarin on the spot. 1 minute, I mixed up the words for 50 and 15, and the vendor laughed. So I laughed too and tried again. The whole exchange taught me more about speaking naturally, like using the right tones to show I was kidding or noticing his body language than any classroom role play ever did. It was messy, but really authentic. So students in this excerpt, she expressed that she really enjoyed bargaining. And this is not only, not only one student expressed that. In our interview, we find a lot of students, they really thought that bargaining, well, in China was the highlight of their learning of the Chinese culture. Because well, I'm sure that all of you have lived in the UK, but in the UK, you do not bargain at all. And the British people, they don't have the culture to bargain because they are reserved and they don't really, they feel it's a kind of shame to bargain over the price. But in China, this is a common practice. So for those kind of reserved British students, the British people, they dare not bargain with the vendor at the very beginning. And then they just timidly started to talk about bargaining because the teacher told them that when you go to the supermarket, you could do so. And then when they started to bargain, they were not able to express 50 and 15 clearly. And this is such a nice practice, okay, to practice their tone of 15和50, okay? And this is the really authentic situation for them to master the right tone. And in this whole process, they learned the language, they experienced the culture, they also developed their skill of, bargaining. Also, they just felt well, it was messy, but really authentic. So they were really excited after their bargaining experience. So this is about informal encounter with the language and also with the culture. And then in excerpt two, went back to the UK, back to the classroom, and student again said that when I got back to the UK, Chinese kind of stayed in the classroom. We'd have our lessons, do homework, but outside that, life went on in English. I tried to keep it up. Like I went to a Chinese restaurant hoping to practice, but I just ended up ordering in Mandarin and then the conversation switched to English. There wasn't a natural way to speak Chinese here. It felt like all the immersive stuff in China was a world apart, and I couldn't really leave Chinese day to day back home. So this is another student talking about her experience of how to keep up her Mandarin, okay, in the UK. And again, she was not alone in expressing such kind of feeling, right? Because in the UK, their learning of Mandarin was more academically focused. Right. And even though this was not a negative thing, well, the student couldn't integrate their Mandarin Chinese in daily life at all. And then their cultural experience was brief and was not deep. And sometimes when they just returned to the UK, they felt that their Mandarin Chinese was no longer as good as it was when they were in China. And I felt actually all of us will have this kind of experience. It just like actually this time last week, I was in Spain. I was in San Sebastian, enjoying the sunshine and also in a kind of very much academic uh, circle and sharing with the international scholars my research. Um, and then I was speaking English so naturally. And back to China, actually, I felt, well, I was no longer in that environment to speak English, right? And even actually, interestingly, on my way to Spain to a kind of more international environment, on my plane, I felt I was able to speak English. But when I was flying back, okay, back to China, I already felt that I was losing my confidence. And I think perhaps some of you have the same kind of feeling. And even now you are residing in the UK, perhaps you are using English every day and perhaps you will feel that you are losing your Chinese competence to some extent. There is a kind of a language attrition. So this is to say that context is very important for language learners. And we are all language learners. Here, I'm not talking about teenagers. We can generate a lot of common experience from one piece of study and to all learners, to learners of all ages. And we are always learners of a language or of languages. Okay. So this is the first theme that I would like to share with you. So we see that in China, leaving the language with students, they leave the language with their whole selves. And they were kind of a waving Mandarin into movement, into sight, sound, and social relationship. While in the UK, well, back to the UK, Mandarin Chinese became a pale shadow and is largely restricting Mandarin to a cognitive exercise within classroom walls. And that's why we need to give the students more language socialization experience and giving them more opportunities to explore other communities for language learning. So my analysis, okay, some findings or some ideas to share with you on this theme is authentic language use flourishes when anchored in cultural and lived experience, and so superficial engagements can limit learning. Cultural gaps can impede willingness to communicate, and a lack of immersion can stall progress. And cultural embodiment in language learning, while immensely beneficial, was not automatically achieved simply by being in a location or doing an activity. It requires deep, sustained engagement and a supportive environment. Okay, Now, I would like to share with you the second theme, that is the classroom to real-world language border crossing. Okay, so in excerpt three, the student said, I find listening to people can be difficult because not everyone speaks the same okay, so I am still sharing the screen with you. Okay, so all of a sudden I was kind of confused whether I'm sharing the screen with you or not. Okay, sorry, let's come back to the excerpt. Okay, so student said, I find listening to people can be difficult because not everyone speaks the same way. Some people some people I might understand, but others have an accent or speak faster, which can be baffling. They often speak very quickly. I've told them I'm still learning Chinese, so they will slow it down a bit. Most of them are friendly. If I ask, they will talk a bit slower until I understand. So in this excerpt, we see that we can understand. Well, perhaps in the UK, in the classroom, students' the medium of instruction was in Mandarin Chinese, right? But actually, the Mandarin that they have learned in the UK was not sufficient in their daily communication. Therefore, when students how many years they have studied in the UK, when they just came to China or came to another community, they felt baffled. And because their Mandarin Chinese was not sufficient for their daily practice, their daily communication. But actually, we can see that in the authentic situation, student, they can develop strategies. Okay, when they realize the local people spoke very fast, very quickly, and immediately they would develop strategies to navigate these two worlds. Okay, and to use strategies to facilitate smoother communication. And this is something that we need to appreciate, and also we need to share with the language learners. Okay, what would happen when you just go to a new community? Okay, what kind of strategies that you could develop? Okay, and also we need to make the learners realize that their classroom communication, their classroom learning would never be sufficient, for their daily communication. Okay, and go into the authentic situation, the authentic life of the target language, community would be essential for language learning. And then for excerpt four, we find a very interesting account of students, staying in China. And this might be deja vu to a lot of you, because the students said that a lot of local people, if they want to converse with us, they would actually try speaking in English. They'd come up and start in English. And the other students said, yeah, they often did that because they would rather practice their English with us. I would answer in Chinese. I have tried that, and it does work. When I replied in Mandarin, they usually continued in Mandarin or in Mandarin Chinese. So this is something very interesting because the students, they came to China to practice their Mandarin Chinese, and then they experienced this kind of an unexpected hurdle. Well, even though this kind of hurdle, the local Chinese, they use English, okay, as a kind of well-intentioned communication, right? But the students, they were really confused because they just came to China only to find that the people there, they would not speak Mandarin with them. But we could understand this because, we Chinese people, we are very much hospitable to those kind of Western guests. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is because of the prestige of English, because the Chinese students or the Chinese people, they are always keen learners. And when they see somebody could speak English, they would rather seize it as a very good opportunity to practice their English, right? But then again, we see immediately this group of teenagers, they developed strategies, right? So they developed strategies to communicate. They replied in Mandarin as a strategy to communicate with the local, to demonstrate, hey, I can speak Mandarin, or hey, let's speak Mandarin. And then the local people would respect their language choice. Okay. And then we see that from this excerpt, students could navigate their language choices, okay, in China and develop their communication strategies. So this is classroom to real world language border crossing. Okay, so from this sharing, okay, these examples or stories, we see that from classroom to language, to real authentic, language communities, right? So usually it's full of language barriers, but also cultural challenges. But the classroom to real world border crossing also involves kind of moments of confusion as well as enlightenment. And through these trials, learners develop true communicative competence. Okay, so this kind of language socialization is not just about, or language learning is not just about the learning of grammar of the language, but also is developing their ability to use the language, to use the target language appropriately and spontaneously, okay, with native speakers. Okay, now let's look at the students' identity transformation, their identity metamorphosis. Okay, so in excerpt 5, I listed a few students, their feeling, their identity changed. Okay, the students felt that I think it had taught me, so their stay in China has taught me that to be more open to trying new things and to take up more opportunities to better myself. I feel more adapted to Chinese work culture than the UK's, where there is just doing whatever to get by. I'm not that type of person. And by the end of my stay in Xi'an, I didn't feel like just a tourist anymore. I almost felt half local, like part of the community. So here the students used more open. I feel I'm more open, I'm more adapted, and I feel half local, like part of the community just after 2 weeks. So we see that their identities have kind of transformed, even though it was a very brief period. And this is kind of indicative in that even though sometimes there were opportunities for short-term language exchange, for short-term, social experience, to in another culture, still we need to seize the opportunities. And this is also leading me to wonder because every January and February, I would take my son to the UK to join the school there. And initially, before our first trip, I was wondering whether that could be helpful because we were only able to stay in the UK for a few weeks. But actually, by doing research, I realized, okay, even though it could be very much short term, still it could be very useful for language learners development of their language and also their identity. So here I would rather encourage you, to create opportunities for your students to have this kind of language socialization, in another speech community or another culture. Okay, so excerpt 6, we also have students sharing their challenges. Okay, for example, the students said, in the UK, I sometimes felt a bit isolated as a Mandarin learner because very few people at school were learning it. So this is to say that the students, when in the UK, they felt they were kind of minority-like, right? They felt very much isolated. Sometimes this could be very much demotivating, right? But when you offer another speech community and the students will feel that he could be part of the community, is finding a sense of belonging, right? Okay. And then the next statement, I had seen videos on YouTube that make places in China look empty, but when I went when I went, it was so busy everywhere. The crowds really shocked me. So this is also articulating the differences between classroom learning and the real life learning, because the students see in the classroom usually would be very much different from the students' authentic experience in that community, and therefore it makes the authentic learning experience, authentic experience more important or significant. And lastly, the students said, at first, I felt uncomfortable when local people wanted photos with me just because I'm foreign. It was weird being treated like a celebrity. And this is also very interesting anecdote. And also, it's not only experience, just articulated by one student. Quite some students, they just shared this idea with us because it was a kind of culture shock to them. Because in the UK, taking photo with teenagers were not allowed. It's kind of illegal, right? And also, even taking photos with adults were not that normal. But in China, it was a very much common practice. Okay, especially even well, teenagers because they were foreign and people would like to take photos with you. And even for me, I just go to some lecture. I go to teacher trainings. After teacher training, sometimes while there will be questions, teachers will ask me some questions. Sometimes just need to stand there and as a kind of idol or celebrity sort of thing, and then they would just take photos with me. So it's a kind of very much different culture. So the students initially they felt very much intrusive, and they felt kind of this was not appropriate. Okay, but gradually they were kind of adapted themselves to this kind of different culture and they accepted it. So there is a kind of identity transformation. They become more open and they learn to understand another culture. Okay, so here we see that identity metamorphosis is a kind of double-edged, okay, process of growth and tension. Emerging, okay, or immersing in Chinese language and culture clearly reshape the students' self-perception, that they become more open, more confident, and even they developed hybrid identities, right? Combining elements of both cultures, because sometimes they feel they are accepted, sometimes they feel they are outsiders, right? But this is very much close to what, in the community of practice of theory and also on identity construction, that language learning or the identity construction is kind of very much fluid and very much multi-voiced. Okay, sometimes you feel you are part of the culture, sometimes you feel you are alienated, and sometimes you feel you are part of the culture or you learn to accept that culture. So the outcome is consistent with Wenger's concept of identity. Okay, so emerging through participation, right? So by engaging in a new community, learners, they expanded their repertoire and their sense of self, their identities. They expanded their identities, or they develop multiple identities. And meanwhile, they navigated challenges of dual belongings, experiencing both the empowerment of feeling part of a new community and the strength of straddling two roles. Okay, so these are the teenagers' experiences. And I'm sure all of you are also straddling, two roles. Sometimes you feel you are part, even though perhaps you have stayed in the UK for 10 years and 20 years, sometimes you feel you are very much part of the community. Sometimes you feel that you are alienated. Sometimes you just resent or you hate that culture. And back to China, you have the same feeling. Sometimes when you are in the UK, you miss Chinese culture, but when back to China, sometimes you feel you are no longer part of the community, and sometimes you still feel you are a member of the Chinese community. Okay, so identity is very fluid. Okay, and it's constructed and reconstructed. Okay, now lastly, I would like to share with you some transformative encounters, okay, articulated by the learners. For example, in excerpt 7, students were sharing his first real-world mentoring success. Okay, he said that even at the airport, when they asked us for drinks, I replied in Mandarin, and they were shocked. It was crazy. Yeah. Okay. And in excerpt 8, okay, the students said, just shared, okay, his kind of crisis in China. Okay, he said, I almost got lost in the market. I told one lady I was lost, but she just said she didn't have time to help me. I found another person and asked in Mandarin to use their phones to call my teacher. Thankfully, I had enough vocabulary, and a teacher managed to find me. So either it was articulating about their first success, or sharing their panic of near failure, or just talking about or being thankful to the strangers' warmth and support and their kindness. Okay, and we see that the students expressed in their statements very much strong emotions. But here, I do not just want to emphasize on the strong emotions. I want to share with you, okay, actually, it is the lasting impact of it, because it's important that the students, okay, to have a strong emotions, but also important is what the students make sense of, the whole event. So after their reflection of the whole thing, okay, so they develop their problem solving competence, and that leads to the personal growth of the students. So here I want to share with you that there could be tensions in the students' intercultural communication, or okay, and in their process of learning the language. Okay, and the learners are positioned by and through discourse, and each challenge forces learners to renegotiate how they fit within the community. Okay, by confronting these tensions head on in real situations, the students, they experience what one describes as learning that goes beyond the textbooks. Okay. So I have shared with you a lot of stories and the students' feelings, and I'm sure that when I'm sharing those stories, and you will have a lot of familiar feelings and also familiar stories, right? But now let's have the summary of everything, right? So we have done, or I have shared with you some quantitative findings and some qualitative findings. For the quantitative surveys, we have discussed the informal interaction patterns of the students in the UK and in China, and we have talked about the formal instructional engagement. Okay, and we also talk about the identity coherence and identity fragmentation. Meanwhile, I shared with you some interview data, and in particular, we focus on 4 themes. That's the cultural embodiment and language practice, the classroom to real-world language border crossing, the students' identity metamorphosis, and their transformative encounter stories. Here, I want to share with you some of the insights. That is, my research have highlighted the importance of cultural engagement, authentic communication, and community support in language socialization and identity construction. And also, I have demonstrated that immersive experiences in China foster more coherent and confident Mandarin identity compared to classroom-based learning in the UK. I want to emphasize in particular the impact of contact on language socialization. That is, the social cultural environments acted as both scaffold and filters. Okay, that is, the social cultural environments sometimes they enable students or the learners interaction into the target community, and sometimes they are the filters, they restrict the identity merging. and the Mandarin as second language learners, their language socialization differs starkly between China and the UK in terms of their immersion methods, in terms of authenticity, and in terms of community engagement. Okay, and sometimes the students are very much confused about their identity, who I am. All right. But the immersive experience and cultural engagements are very much crucial for developing students' second language identities, and we need to create this kind of experience for the language learners. And context determines whether language learners can authentically claim, I speak Mandarin in both words and in their identity construction. So I have shared with you, data that I have gathered, just from those kind of teenagers. But I'm sure I would say language learning and language education research is without very much clear demarcation lines. There is not really a clear border for language learning and language research. Okay, so there are a lot of implications that we can draw from this teenager research. That is, language education policies should prioritize creating opportunities for authentic cultural engagement and community support to foster integrated second language identities. And educators and policymakers should consider the interplay between language, culture, and identity when designing language programs and supporting learners. Okay, so actually, this is a work in progress. I'm still writing this paper for a special issue of the journal Language, Culture, and Curriculum. And hopefully, if I can, write it well, and okay, if it's good enough, it can be published next year. All right. But also, I would say this research is not my own, my individual research is a kind of a team of researchers. Especially, I'm very much grateful to my research assistant, Lai Xuanying, and she has helped gathering a lot of data and also did some of the data analysis. So that's why I haven't had the kind of a list of references here because it's a kind of still developing. But if you are interested in research, I would like to send my references as a pack to all of you. Thank you very much. I think that's about my research. OK，谢谢大家。嗯，
谢谢潘林老师，谢谢，真的是很精彩。特，
其实
谢谢
比较
谢谢。
比较的，其实是比较初步。另外，我突然发现今天好像说英语说的，好像就像我，哎，我一出国马上我就觉得会说，然后一回来以后就觉得，哎，怎么好像就 not in the mood？但是呢，这个东西也可以，我们比如说，如果大家有问题，我们也可以用那个 question and answer 的这种方式呢，来跟大家来 share 一下啊，对，然后也可以用中文，
很好，真的是特别感谢。我觉得听了您的这个报告之后呢，确实从理论上解释了我很多我自己观察到的大学生的现象。就像您
嗯
说的，就这个它确实是可以，虽然是对一个针对青少年的研究，但是它真的解释了很多我们观察到的，但是在理论上我们又没有这么像您这样详细的、谨慎的证明过的一个过程。然后呢，就看到这个语言学习和这个身份构建之间的这些非常微妙的而且动态化的关系。比如说，我觉得，之前我有过一些经历，比如说跟这个中文系大四的学生，就是他在中国做过1年的 year abroad，他回来之后确实像您说的，跟这些 teenager 是一样的，他有一个身份的转换。
嗯
不光是在语言的水平上，还有在自我的认同上，它确实是有一些不一样的。那我自己也确实经历过这些，像您刚才说的，我有一个就是终于有一个机会能到巴黎去做一个这种 immerse 的法语的学习，然后我就特别愿意去跟这个商场的人呐、或者跟大街上的人说法语，但是他们马上就转到英语了。然后 这个就让我也觉得，哎，是我什么地方做错了，还是怎么样？那现在通过这个，我就发现它是在文化上面，学习语言是一个很复杂的过程。那么文化上面的一些这种社区意识，或者是他们之间对你的看法、你的身份的看法，我们对自我身份的看法，的确会影响到我们语言的交流和学习。所以再次感谢您，我觉得这个非常非常有意思。然后我们肯定在座的老师也有好多的想法啊，就不好意思，我今天因为我有点儿花粉症，所以，
还在
如果
花粉症哈，我们也是，
对。
开始花粉症，然后我那时候直流眼泪。
我的
对，
流眼泪刚刚好，但是
嗯
但是现在可能就声音，如果大家有什么问题想问潘林老师，大家就自动开麦，可以直接问，或者您
嗯，
在这个chat 里面打出来也可以，我帮您读出来也可以。那我们欢迎，嗯，
我先分享，我可以，如果没有问题，我也可以先分享一下，
好，
可以吗？就
可以啊，
是因为其
可以，
我刚才说的，我刚才那个，其实我说我可以中英文夹杂着来聊哈，然后呢，然后刚才呢也没有来得及，所以我觉得我呢，也就是现在把这个主要内容讲完了以后呢，也想跟大家分享一下为什么要做这个研究，或者
嗯
是我为什么要分享这个研究。其实我觉得做这样的研究，最主要的就是让我们对我们自己作为 language learners，以及对我们的学生有更大限度的宽容。因为尤其是这个 identity construction，还有我们在不同的 community 当中的这种语言社会化的过程 （language socialization 的过程），我们当时，我们如果不做这个研究，我们其实是非常 confused 的。我
嗯
们经常会觉得，哎，我为什么是这样？然后呢，我们对自己不够包容，甚至有时候会影响了我们对这个 target community 的，一些。我们会有一些主观的，就是对他的排斥。
嗯
比如说我有的学生他去了，我有一个学生他去了曼大，他去做的是短期交流。那么他刚回来，我就跟大家分享一些故事来说明这个有多么重要哈，这个话题。他本来是想在就是曼大做一个 exploration visit，就是我去。他大三去曼大了以后，他打算为他申请研究生做一个准备。但是因为他在曼大，他 suffered，他 suffered what？他的钱包被偷了
哟
或者他就有这种情况，然后他就觉得外国太不安全了，或者他的 identity 就有一个 crash，他就觉得中国特别好，然后他就再也不想出国了。那么在这种下，他作为一个英语的 learner，然后呢，他就觉得他再也不想出国。那么其实他现在就开始在中国决定他要保研在中国。那么其实你作为一个 language learner，那你就失去了在国外的这个，你不能因为一个 failure 而对整个的 community 就是一个 denial。所以在这种情况，他那种情况是极端的，但是我相信我们每个人在国外都会有这样或者那样的 identity crash，或者是 barriers。你不能因为这种，如果你要做了这方面的研究，你就会对另外的一个 community 更加宽容。然后有时候我们出了国以后，我不知道你们有没有这种感觉，就是我刚到英国时候，我就开始 blame my education in China。就是虽然我的 academic English was so good 就是那时候我记得我们 doctoral school 的 这个 head 说，Wow, your English is so good。然后我就特别 proudly said，我说 I received all my education in China。但是其实我虽然在我们学校，我能够这么 proudly 来说，我说我是在中国接受的教育，但是我一进到 supermarket，我就完蛋了，我不知道卖的是啥。对吧？然后我就开始 blame my education in China。我说我在中国都学的什么呀？我去 seeing the doctor，我不知道怎么跟那个 doctor 来 communicate。但是呢，其实我们通过我今天的研究，
嗯
其实它就是一个能够特别好的让 learners 以及对 educators，让他们能够告诉他们的 learners，就是我在我们的每一个 community 都是有学习和交流的局限的。所以
嗯
我觉得主要做这种 language socialization 和 identity construction，它的 significance。 就是要宽容，同时要创造更多的机会啊。这个跟大家来说一下啊。
是是是，这个非常有必要。就是尤其是像您刚才说的，他有可能就因为一件事儿，他对整个中国、整个中国文化，他就产生了一个抵触情绪或者不理解，然后他就
对
选择我就再也不学中文了，或者我不想再跟他有任何的这个整个文化有任何交流。那我们也是，我们就是之前杜伦大学，我们商学院有开这个比较初级的中文课程。但是呢，这个学完结束之后呢，只能到这个 A1.1的 level，就是他的中文其实是很有限。那有说明他跟这个文化的这个交流也是很有限的嘛，就很短的时间。可是之后
嗯
我们马上就要带着他们到清华，或者到北大，或者到中国的其他的大学，还有一些公司去参观，然后去学习这个商业的课程。那去
嗯
之前呢，那商学院的老师和我们语言学院的老师，我们就有在这方面针对他可能面临的文化冲击。进行一些培训的意识，但是那个时候还
嗯
没有读到您的这个文章，所以当时我们就是本能反应有一些，比如说可能会造成的，就像您刚
嗯
才说的拍照问题，那我们可能
嗯
就会跟学生说，如果有人跟你拍照，你不想拍，你就礼貌的回绝他就可以了。但是他们没有恶意，但是说了其实也没，就是他们到了之后回来还是反馈，还是觉得怎么那么奇怪，因为他们时间也短，学习语言的时间也短。那之后有一些人可能就说我决定保留说英语，反正我也不是语言学院的学生，那我将来就怎么样。所以我觉得您这个研究就特别重要。那作为我们教育者，我们就知道应该怎么做，或者是可能可以怎么做，更好的来帮助他们。那作为我们自己在这个国家，可能也会好一些。那我现在对这个法国人，我的原谅程度也高一些，因为我发现很多法国人是因为他自己说英语的信心不够，所以他不愿意别人一上来就说英语。可是如果你说了法语呢，他又不愿意。所以就这个是可能是文化跟这个我们叫社群性，那他
对
自己的这方面，所以非
对，
常非常有意思。那我们可不可以潘老师接受我们的一些问题？有没
好的，
有有没有
可以的。
哪些老师我要苏芳老师有问题？
潘老师你好，我觉得是特别受启发。就是您在讲的过程当中，我一直在想，哦，原来是我所看到的这些很 common 的这些现象，原来可以跟一些理论联系
嗯
上。我
嗯
觉得这个就是对我，尤其是像我们经常在教学当中，语
嗯，
言跟跨文化交流谈的比较多，但是
对，
您今天的这个语言社会化社
嗯
会性和他
嗯
的这个身份的建构，我觉得真的是打开我的另外的一个角度，所以特
嗯
别感谢您。然后我想问一下您，就是说，那会不会有一些学生他在经历过后表现出来的一种混合身份？就比如说像我自己，就是有些时候虽然我们在这个国家待了很长时间，但是就是在某些情况之下，你会觉得，哎呀，我的中文也不好了，我的英文也不好了，就对自己的这个身份有一个混合的认知。就
会，
我在想，那些学生们他们会不会也有类似的？那
嗯。
这种身份怎么样通过语言和社交行为体现出来呢？
嗯，其实我觉得您说的特别好，就是其实我们关注的都是 intercultural communication，但是今天我讲的有点 social culture 方面，其实它也是一种 intercultural communication，也就是在这种 intercultural communication 的过程当中，我觉得我们就是需要让我们自己宽容，我们自己宽容自己，我们宽容其他人，然后同时呢，我们也要让我们的学生要更加的宽容。所以就是您刚才说的这种混合式的身份这种 hybrid identity，其实就是我今天跟大家分享的，就是学生，每个人只要他进行跨文化交流，他都会 gradually develop 这种 hybrid identity 这是很正常的一种情况。所以我就经常说，今天哪怕是在同一个 community，只要你经历一些事情，你也会这个就是一个 identity，要么我说它是一个 fluid，是一个 multi voice 的 是吧？然后是一个 constructed and reconstructed，所以我经常说，我们今天的自己和昨天的自己也是不一样的。我们在讲座前的自己和我们现在的自己也是不一样的。那么其实我自己也是这样，就是我经常就说，我记得我从出国之前哈，我这说话有点没边儿。然后我出国之前，我记得我们的领导把我当做一个又红又专的一个这个未来接班人养。然后我到了英国，我就 developed my critical thinking，然后还是我的身体还是我的身体，但是我再回国以后，我就是不是那个特别乖的又红又专的，你就有 critical thinking 了，然后你呢又再也回不去那个20年前的你的自己，但是你要学会接受你自己，就是你要学会，因为你永远不是你自己。我们的 identity，哪怕就不作为 language learner，我们都是一个 fluid，这是一个 post-structural 的一个这个 idea。所以在这种情况下呢，我觉得就是hybrid identity 是 identity 本身它就是一个 multiple voice 的，所以呢，我们不要纠结，就是我们不要纠结我们到底是哪种 identity，而是要学会正视我们的 identity，学会 critical 的看待我们的 identity，甚至我们有时候，因为它是不断的 reconstructed，我们也需要学会在某种意义上，某些 setting 要控制我们的 identity，我觉得是这样哈。对，
哇，
谢
谢谢你，
谢您的
谢谢。
提
那
然后
就是
对，然后那个还有苏芳老师，您刚才说的一件事情，我觉得也是，刚才我突然想到，后来我是不是又忘了？就是，哎呀，我突然就给忘了。您刚才说了特别重要的一点，哦，就是这个 research 的意义。我觉得您说这一点特别好，也是我想跟老师们分享的，就是 research 来源于什么？它不是所谓的高大上的，所有的我们不是要研究所有的人看不懂、听不懂的 research，它就是源于生活。它的 research 就是所有我们生活看来最 daily 的、最 minute、最 trivial 的东西，你给它上升到理论层次，它就能够被 distributed，它就能变成 philosophy。在某种意义上，因为古老师以前应该也是学的 philosophy 吧，这种特别高大上的东西，往往它是来源于最底层的生活的。所以我这一点呢，我也想分享一下，我以前的第一位导师是 Ian Blomat，然后呢，他就跟我聊天，他说他在美国做访问学者的时候，跟一个特别著名叫Silverstein 两个人哈在一起聊天，然后呢，他们第一天在咖啡馆里说的最简单的东西，然后 Michael Silverstein 第二天就 present paper，就写出了一篇 paper，然后那个 paper 就是谁都看不懂的，那就是 academic paper，但是它都是源于这个最基本的理论。那么它变成 philosophy，它其实可以。现在我研究的其实也是 local setting，但是像古老师说的法国的东西，其实你就在不同的 setting，其实是有不同的 language socialization，有不同的 identity construction，那么它都是源于同一种理论，在不同的这个 social setting 当中，它又有不同的利用。那么这样的话，我们就把同样一个道理就给它传播开来，这就叫做研究的百花齐放，百家争鸣。对，所以我觉得这是非常非常有意义的。对，
谢谢您，听也很受鼓舞啊！就是对于我们教学，尤其是以教学为主老师，其实我们真的是需要有这样的一个 sense。
对，就是我们最基础的，哪怕最 local 的 everyday happening，在我们课堂当中，我们作为 teaching practitioners，我们都可以把它当做我们研究点，然后用一些理论把它呈现，甚至流传，就让它有影响力，然后甚至流传下去。
好，谢谢你。就是接着上一个问题，我能再问一个问题吗？
好的，
我想问就是，你所研究的这些学生，他们在中国和在英国是否有过，比如说强烈的局外人或者局内人的感觉，就是比较强烈的，而这种感受会不会对他们中文的动机有影响？
会有啊，其实刚才其实也提到过，就是学生在英国学中文，尤其是有的学校，他学中文是 minority，他就会觉得特别 marginalized，甚至其实大家都在英国，我们都知道 modern foreign languages，你说实话，你中文虽然有 MEP 项目啊，尤其是就是在中学，但是中学的话，其实有好多的 modern foreign languages 在 competing with each other，大学更是这样啊。那 Mandarin Chinese 你不是一个很大的语言，所以很多的 modern foreign languages 都在 compete。那你这个学生有时候就会觉得，我学它有什么用？尤其他看不到他去中国的机会或者用中文的机会，他有时候就会有 drop outs。那这是我们经常会碰到，所以为什么我们就是其实，在大学，虽然我们现在近些年哈，就是 Mandarin Chinese Excellence Program 这些学生越来越多，但是大学其实很多年我们这个 recruitment 还是比较 limited，对吧？但是我觉得像这个 Mandarin Excellence Program 这么 intensive learning Mandarin，然后给他们创造这些机会，我觉得其实它是一个 transitional 的，就是这些学生他们即将要步入大学，应该在未来一些年。就是这个 program 啊，这么多年培养出的学生，其实是为大学来输送，会输送一些学生。你们可以去来看一下，这也就是为什么这个要讲 MEP，因为 MEP 它是一个已经被 renew 了哈，就是已经5年再 renew 5年，那么这些学生他们慢慢的会不断的有一些人通过这种 intensive learning，他会对中国有一个很强的就是认可的意识，他在某些方面他有可能在大学会继续的学这门课程，所以我觉得这就是为什么我要讲 MEP 项目，因为它是对于我们所有的大学的这些老师们，你们会知道这些学生他是什么样的 competence，他们是什么样的 background。这样的话，我们也知道我们以后怎么样来应对这些学生因为他们已经很有这个 proficiency 了，然后他们也有这个 cultural gaps，这个前面我们也讲过，他们有时候其实，在英国有时候也 motivated，但是他们觉得那个 motivation 是 transient，就是一会儿就没了，我们写一次大字就没了，是吧？然后在中国也是，有时候他就觉得太短了，但是有时候他会觉得有 gap，他不愿意回，就觉得都 half local 了，是吧？就那种感觉，就不愿意回来，他就会有这种强烈的在中国的 emotional attachment。这样的话，就是他的一种 motivation，他会好好学英文，他会强烈的，他会变成一个以后很多学生，我们其实还有一个 data 没有 present 出来，就是学生觉得对自己的未来的期望，很多学生就说以前我也没有什么特别 clear goal，现在我觉得我要以后的工作要跟中文相关，我还要继续大学继续要学，他就是这样，就是你有时候这个，对，
好，谢谢你，我问
嗯
完了，看看其他老师的问题
对。
吧。
谢谢潘林老师，谢谢苏芳老师，其他老师有什么问题吗？那我能不能借这个见缝插针问一个比较就是具体的问题，就是关于咱们这个 MEP 的项目。然后潘老师，我想问您，就是咱们这些学生的语言水平是从零开始的统一水平，还是说他们本身？因为我看到您的数据，他们有一些学生可能会有一些以前的背景，比如说有 heritage 的，就爸爸或者妈妈其中一方可能会说中文的。那么他们这个语言水平上面有没有分级呢？
我们一般recruit 的时候，其实大部分都是从零开始的。你如果他的英语他的水平太高了的话，有时候就是他都已经水平那么高了，他自己到 MEP 项目当中的话，有可能也对于他们来说也是不公平的。但是呢，我不知道，因为毕竟现在有76个学校，有可能也是不一样，因为咱也不知道那个这个就是有的学校是不是有这种极个别的情况，也有学生确实，你看你要是家里有 Mandarin Chinese 这个 parent，我们有时候也不能说就完全，人家又有这个意愿，你不可能就完全阻止，因为我记得就是我们在我另外一个研究当中哈，就是研究老师的，因为我对这个 MEP 项目是有各个综合方面的这个研究，这也是我未来要希望能写一本书来呈现各方面吧，因为这是一个非常 significant 的一个 milestone。那么像那些老师就会 说那个他们家的谁谁谁会说中文，然后本来我们都没要他，他非要加入我们这个项目。所以就在这种情况下呢，就是那我们也没有办法，因为我们毕竟不是说来 limit students
嗯，
learning Mandarin Chinese，而是 promote the language。所以我觉得这一点，他的 goal 就是要让学生变成 proficient Mandarin 这个 speakers。所以呢，我觉得这方面也
没
是
有限制。
对，没有
嗯。
限制，对
明
对对，
白明白，那他
对。
的这个，我看他从中学安排课的角度来讲，他其实还挺 intense 的。他是每周大概8个小时，8个小时的话，那他从零开始3年学习到 Year 10，那就是从 Year 7就初一开始，等于是就一到中学开始。那他这个到 Year 10，他可以去中国之前，他是一个什么样的 level 呢？是 GCSE 呢，还是说？
学生会考 SSK、HSK，然后
哦，
但是呢，有的学生他们是这样，就是说他们就是每年他们都会有一个考试，然
嗯
后呢，这个因为我原来做 MEP coordinator 的时候，我们还负责这方面的考试，但是他们很多学生都是来做这个，他们都会考这 HSK 的，所以这个目前是不是 compulsory 的，我还不太清楚。但
嗯。
是呢，我觉得他们每年的这个 hurdle test 是要做的，但是他们具体，我觉得很多他们的水平都已经很好了。然后有的人还跟我说，要没有这个 MEP 这个 intensive learning 的话，他们有可能还达不到怎么样的水平。就是这个2周对于他们的 language proficiency 也是特别有帮助的。嗯，
嗯，这个真的是对语言学习绝对是有好处的，因为我看到您的数据里面说，这个考 GCSE 啊，这个汉语排名到 Modern Foreign Language 的第8，我就在数哈，你说这是一共有
对对，
多少个
二
Foreign
零一
Language？
三年是，好像
是
现在高
不是？
了。
一共你从法语、德语数到最后第8，好像听着不是很低，但其实是非常低的这么一个情况。所以我们也是非常希望能够 promote 这个更多的中文。那这个是真是非常有意思，太好了，谢谢您。我没有太多的问题，请问哪位老师还有问题吗？或者苏芳老师，我们现在是不是可以 stop recording？然后这样的话，大家可能就是更
就是
更 casual 的来谈一下这个问题，可以吗，苏老师？
可以，但
好，
因为我们以往就是录下来是可能我们的问题也刚好是其他老师想问的问题，所以我们就一
有道理。
直录到最后，是这
好，
样子的。
明白。
好的，好的，
好，
您定的，
没问题。那我们看看还有没有哪个老师有问题想问潘林老师的？
目前看好像没有。
没有是吗？那我先暂停录像。谢
嗯。
谢大家，再次感谢大家能来参加，也谢谢潘林老师给我们带来这么精彩、这么有意思的一个分享。